The date is November 14th, 2025, somewhere inside Althorpe House, in a private study lined with books that once belonged to generations of Spencers. Charles Spencer is said to have opened a drawer he had not touched in nearly 30 years. Inside that drawer, folded in cream-colored paper, was a letter. Not a press cutting, not a photograph, a letter, handwritten in the unmistakable slanted script of his sister Diana, Princess of Wales, and the name on the envelope was not his. It was not Harry's. It was not William's. It was hers. Princess Anne. What if I told you that for nearly 3 decades, one of the most personal letters Princess Diana ever wrote was quietly held back from the world, and that the woman it was addressed to may have known things about Diana's final years that no biographer, no documentary, no royal insider ever uncovered? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what Charles Spencer is now said to have revealed, why this letter matters, and what it tells us about the strange, unspoken bond between the People's Princess and the Princess Royal. Before we go any further, hit subscribe, because this story does not stay in one place, and what comes at the end will leave you sitting with it long after the screen goes dark. To understand why this letter matters, you have to understand who Diana was in the years leading up to it. Not the Diana of the magazines, not the Diana of the charity galas, the private Diana. The one who, by the mid-1990s, had been separated from Charles for 3 years, stripped of her HRH style in August 1996, and left to navigate an institution that had begun, quietly and methodically, to treat her as an outsider. She was 35 years old. She had 2 boys, William at Eton, Harry still at Ludgrove. She was living at Kensington Palace, apartments 8 and 9, in rooms that had begun to feel more like a waiting area than a home. And she was, according to those closest to her, deeply, painfully alone. Now think about that for a moment. A woman watched by the entire planet, photographed thousands of times a week. And yet, when the palace doors closed, she had almost no one inside the family who spoke to her the way family speaks. Almost no one, but not quite no one, because there was Anne, Princess Anne, the Princess Royal. The daughter of a queen, the sister of a king in waiting, the hardest working member of the family by every metric that could be counted. Anne, who by 1996 had already been divorced herself from Captain Mark Phillips in 1992, and had quietly remarried Timothy Lawrence in a small ceremony in Scotland that same year. Anne, who had lived through her own tabloid storms in the 1980s and emerged not softer, but harder, more private, more armored. Anne, who had never publicly warmed to Diana and whom the press had long painted as cold toward her sister-in-law. That is the story you have been told. That is the version that has hardened into fact. But here's the thing. What Charles Spencer is now said to have revealed suggests that story was never quite true. According to sources close to the Spencer family, the letter Diana wrote to Anne was dated somewhere in the spring of 1997. Some accounts place it in late April, others early May. Only weeks, perhaps months, before the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on August 31st. It was written on Kensington Palace stationery, folded twice, and sent by private courier rather than through the usual channels. And what it contained, according to those who have now seen it, was not a complaint, not a plea, not a confession of the kind the tabloids would have salivated over. It was, they say, a thank you. Stay with this, because the meaning of that word in this context changes everything. For years, biographers have combed through Diana's correspondence. Andrew Morton's tapes gave us her voice. Paul Burrell's memoirs gave us fragments of her hand. Tina Brown, Sally Bedell Smith, Ingrid Seward, all of them assembled portraits from the letters that leaked, the letters that surfaced, the letters that were auctioned. And in all of that mountain of paper, one figure remained almost entirely absent. And Diana's letters to the Queen have been quoted. Her letters to Charles have been dissected. Her notes to her sons, her staff, her friends, her therapist, all of it has been picked over. But Anne? Anne was the silence. Until now, because what Charles Spencer is said to have described in a private conversation that has since made its way into the reporting of royal watchers is a letter in which Diana thanked Anne for one specific act, Not a public one, not a photographed one. A quiet one. A phone call, reportedly made by Anne to Diana in the difficult weeks following the divorce being finalized on August 28, 1996. A phone call that, according to the letter, lasted less than 20 minutes, but that Diana wrote had, in her words, reminded her that she was still a person and not a problem. Read that line again. Still a person and not a problem. Because if that phrase is real, and if it was written in Diana's own hand, then it tells you something about how she had come to see herself inside the institution. Not as a princess, not as a mother of a future king, but as a problem to be managed. A file on someone's desk. A situation the men in gray were still trying to contain. And it tells you something else. That Anne, the sister-in-law the world had assumed disliked her, had, at least once, picked up the phone and treated her like a human being. Ask yourself something. How much of what we think we know about the royal family is built on assumption? On the frozen face at a public event? The missed handshake? The seating arrangement at a christening? How much of what we call royal history is actually just royal choreography, mistaken for feeling? Because the letter, if Spencer's account is accurate, does not stop at gratitude. It moves on to something more difficult. Diana, according to the sources describing it, wrote to Anne about William and Harry, about what she feared they would face if anything ever happened to her. She did not name a fear. She did not predict the crash. But she wrote, in a passage that those who have seen it describe as almost unbearable to read now, that she hoped Anne would be. In her words, one of the ones who kept remembering they were boys before they were princes. One of the ones who kept remembering they were boys before they were princes. Sit with that sentence. Because it was written by a mother who, whether she consciously knew it or not, was writing it into a future she would not live to see. William was 14. Harry was 12. And within 4 months of that letter being sent, both of them would be walking behind her coffin down the mall. Past a nation frozen in disbelief, past cameras that would burn that image into the century. And who was there, in the days that followed, quietly present at Balmoral, quietly organizing, quietly not talking to the press? And if you've made it this far, hit like, because what comes next is the part that Charles Spencer, according to those close to him, waited nearly 30 years to say out loud. And it is the part that reframes not just Diana's death, but the years that followed it. Because the letter, sources say, contained one more passage, a passage Spencer himself is described as having read multiple times before deciding to speak of it now. A passage that, if authentic, may explain why Anne has, for the entire span of her nephew's adult lives, treated William and Harry with a consistency that no other senior royal has quite matched. She has never spoken publicly about either of them in a critical way. She has never briefed against them. She was reportedly one of the few family members to maintain calm, private contact with Harry after his departure from royal duties in 2020. She has, in her own severe, unsentimental way, been steady. And now, we may know why. Because Diana, in that letter, is said to have made a request. Not a demand. Not a legal instruction. A request, from one woman to another. From one sister-in-law to a sister-in-law she had not always understood. She asked Anne, quietly, if the day ever came when she could not be there herself, to remember the boys. Not to raise them. Not to intervene. Just to remember them. To be a presence in the room even when she could not be. Think about what that means. Think about what it means to write those words in the spring of 1997. Seal the envelope and never speak of it again. And think about what it means that Anne, if she received such a letter, apparently kept its contents entirely to herself for 28 years. Now, the palace has not, as of this recording, confirmed the existence of any such letter. Buckingham Palace does not, as a rule, comment on private correspondence. And Kensington Palace has said nothing. Charles Spencer's own team has neither confirmed nor denied the specific quotes attributed to him. But what royal watchers are pointing to is the pattern. Spencer has, over the last several years, become a more careful custodian of his sister's memory. He spoke at length about her in interviews around the 25th anniversary of her death in 2022. He allowed cameras inside Althorp for the first time in years. He has taken legal action, quietly and effectively, against those he believed had exploited her image. In 2023, his testimony helped push forward the reopening of scrutiny into the 1995 Panorama interview and the deceptions used by Martin Bashir to secure it. This is not a man who speaks casually about his sister. When he speaks, sources say, he speaks with weight. And this time, he is said to be speaking because he believes the record needs correcting. For decades, the narrative of Diana inside the royal family has been one of isolation, rejected by the Queen, betrayed by Charles, watched with suspicion by Philip, ignored by the wider family. That narrative has fueled 1,000 documentaries. It has sold millions of books. It has become, for many people, the definitive shape of her story. But what if that shape was incomplete? What if, inside a family that the public sees only in tableau, there were quiet acts of kindness that were never meant to be seen? What if Anne, the daughter the Queen once called her most capable, had done something in the spring of 1997 that history has never known about? And that Diana, in the last months of her life, wanted to make sure was recorded? At least on one piece of paper. That is the question this revelation forces you to sit with. And here's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because the reporting around Spencer's disclosure suggests something else. The letter, some sources claim, was not kept at Althorp all these years. It was kept, they say, by Anne herself. Held in a private archive at Gatcombe Park, the 730-acre Gloucestershire estate the late Queen gave her in 1976. Held quietly, without fuss, without display. And then, at some point in the last 18 months, quietly returned. Not to the palace, not to the Royal Archives at Windsor, but to Charles Spencer, to Diana's brother, to the man who had stood in Westminster Abbey on September 6, 1997, and delivered the eulogy that shook the monarchy to its foundations. If that is true, and it remains an if, then what Anne did in returning that letter was itself an act of enormous quiet meaning. She returned it to the family that had raised the woman who wrote it. She placed it, 30 years later, back on Spencer's soil. And she said, in effect, this belongs with her people now. That is not the act of a cold woman. That is the act of a woman who understood, perhaps more than anyone else inside that family, exactly what Diana had lost, and exactly what her sons had been left with. Now zoom out for a moment. Consider what this changes. Consider the ripple effects. For the king, this revelation, if it is as described, sits at an awkward angle. Charles has spent much of the last 3 years of his reign attempting to soften the story of his marriage to Diana, to fold Camilla into a public role, to move the family forward. But every time a new fragment of Diana surfaces, from letters to recordings to fresh testimony about the Bashir affair, the past is dragged back into the room. And this one, unlike the others, does not accuse him. It does not attack him. It simply reveals that inside the family he leads, there was a friendship the world never saw, between his sister and the wife he lost. Palace watchers say that is, in some ways, harder to respond to than a scandal. For William and Harry, the implications are more personal. Both brothers, in different ways, have spoken publicly about their mother in recent years. William in the 2017 documentary marking the 20th anniversary of her death. Harry in his 2023 memoir Spare, which sold 1.4 million copies on its first day in English alone. And yet, in all of that testimony, neither brother has ever described the moment their mother wrote to their aunt about them. If the letter is real, they may be learning about it now, at the same time the public does. Think about what that means. Think about what it would feel like to discover, in your 40s, that your mother, in the last months of her life, quietly entrusted your memory to the one aunt you might not have expected. For Anne herself, this changes almost nothing on the surface. She will continue her engagements. She will continue her patronages, all 300 plus of them. She will continue to be, by every count, the busiest member of the family. But behind the scenes, sources describe her as, in the words of one royal watcher, quietly relieved. relieved that the letter is no longer only hers, relieved that the burden of that private knowledge has, at last, been shared. And for the institution itself, this is the moment the story becomes something larger than gossip. Because what Charles Spencer is said to have revealed is not a scandal. It is not a leak in the old sense. It is a correction. A quiet, deliberate correction to a story the world thought it had finished writing. The palace that built its entire identity on control was, in this instance, not controlling anything at all. It was watching, from a distance as a private act of grace from 1997 finally became visible in 2025. And that, for a family whose entire modern brand depends on managing what the world sees, is a shift with consequences. Royal historians will now inevitably begin to reread the years between 1997 and today with new eyes. Every appearance Anne made at events involving her nephews. Every quiet phone call reported in the margins of memoirs. Every moment she was seen, without fanfare, at a christening, a wedding, a funeral. All of it will be recontextualized. Not as duty, not as protocol, but as, possibly, the fulfillment of a promise made on paper in the spring of 1997. Ask yourself something. How many other promises like this exist inside that family? How many other letters are sitting in drawers at Gatcombe, at Bagshot Park, at Highgrove, at Balmoral? How many other quiet acts have never surfaced because the people involved understood something the tabloids never did? That some things are not meant to be currency. Because here is what this story ultimately tells you. The royal family as an institution is often described as a machine, cold, procedural, indifferent, and in many ways that description is fair. But inside that machine are human beings. And human beings, even the ones with tiaras and titles and centuries of history behind their names, sometimes pick up the phone. Sometimes write letters. Sometimes remember that the woman on the other end of the line is a person, not a problem. Diana knew that. She wrote it down, and Anne, if the reporting is accurate, carried it with her for nearly 3 decades. That is not the story the public was told. But it may, in the end, be the truer one. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we close. Charles Spencer, in the version of events now circulating, is said to have made a choice about when to reveal the letter's existence. He did not do it in 2017 for the 20th anniversary. He did not do it in 2022 for the 25th. He waited. Sources close to him suggest he waited until he was certain the letter had made its full private journey. Until Anne had returned it. Until the family members most affected, William and Harry, were old enough and settled enough in their own lives to receive it without it destabilizing them. And until, perhaps, he felt that the version of Diana the public was carrying had begun to flatten into something too simple, too tragic, too one-note. He waited, in other words, until the story needed telling. And now it has been told, or at least the outline of it has. The letter itself remains, as far as anyone outside a very small circle knows, unpublished. Its exact words are not in the public domain. Its full contents may never be. And that in itself is a kind of grace. Because Diana, whatever else she was a woman who spent her life being read. Her clothes read. Her expressions read. Her silences read. If there is one letter of hers that stays, in essence, hers, and only reaches the world in the shape of what it meant rather than what it literally said, then perhaps that is the right ending for it. Perhaps that is the letter finally being allowed to do what it was written to do. Not to be famous. Not to be quoted. Just to be received. If you've made it this far, hit like. Because stories like this don't stay buried for long, and the ones that surface deserve to be sat with, not scrolled past. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because there is one more person we haven't talked about yet. One more figure inside this family whose relationship with Diana has never been fully told, and whose name, sources say, appears in a second letter, one that Charles Spencer has not yet spoken of publicly, but which those close to him say may be even more difficult to read than the first. That is a story for another day. For now, picture it. A drawer at Althorpe, closed again. A letter, folded, waiting. A woman who has been gone for 28 years, still speaking, still asking, still trusting that somewhere on the other side of the paper, someone would remember that her boys were boys before they were princes. And somewhere in Gloucestershire, an aunt who never spoke of it, who never needed to, going about her day, as she always has, quietly, capably, and without applause. Sometimes the loudest stories in that family are the ones told in the softest voices, and sometimes, 30 years later, we finally learn how to hear them.